in the 90s when, as you said, there was this fierce disagreement about whether or not expanding NATO would be a good idea. And of course, the chief critics were people like George Kennan or William Perry, James Baker, Jack Matlock, all of these heavyweights. But it seemed that once the decision had been made, this very polarizing issue suddenly, it seemed like they essentially accepted this is the new situation on the ground. This is let's all just organize around the narrative that this was unproblematic. Well, to some extent, because by the time we reached 2008, when the issue of NATO going to Ukraine and Georgia, then you still had some very fierce opposition. That is, well, less fierce perhaps from people like former CIA director Robert Gates, but you had those what was the WikiLeaks from William Burns when he made the point that, well, if you try to pull Ukraine into NATO, we're going to have a civil war and probably a Russian intervention, which the Russians do not want to do, but which they would feel compelled to do. So apparently there was already, even up to 2008, there was a recognition that this would be quite mad. Merkel back in those days, she referred to this, that the Russians would interpret this as a declaration of war. So 2008 is not that long ago, because from 2008 till now, we went to saying that, well, NATO has nothing to do with this. But I guess, what is it about Ukraine that's so special, though? Because now the argument is, what about Sweden, Finland? Why isn't Russia invading there? So what is it about Ukraine that makes, which in the in the language of again, William Burns, this was the reddest of the red lines for the Russians.
Right, and Bill Burns' cable was not just something that came out in WikiLeaks. He published it in his book. He actually got that cable declassified and is out there in public for anyone to read. And the title of that cable was "Niet means Niet." And he essentially said, look, there is no one across the Russian political spectrum from the far left to the far right that believes that Ukrainian membership in NATO is something that Russia can tolerate. They will react. And that proved absolutely accurate. Now, the question you're asking is, how did we get to the point where there was real recognition, at least among parts of the Western political community, that this was a problematic development, to convincing ourselves that NATO enlargement had nothing whatsoever to do about this? Well, I think part of it is that the authors of that enlargement became they became the power brokers in Washington. They reached levels of government where they were making key decisions about American foreign policy. And they're not about to stand up in public and say, yeah, we were wrong. We shouldn't have done that. Their position on this was, look, nothing that we did remotely caused or justified the Russian invasion. They're not going to take responsibility for that. That's the first part of this. Another part is that a new generation of Russia experts arose in the West. These are people who did not get their training and education in what I would call classic realpolitik, balance of power foreign policies. These were people that went to graduate school during a period when we all thought we could transform these countries. We could hasten their transition from communist totalitarianism and authoritarianism to liberal market democracies. And a lot of the curriculum in major Russia studies programs focused on this transition. So you didn't have to know about geopolitics on all of this. The geopolitics take care of themselves. Russia will change. It will become like us. And democratic peace theory would then ensure that there would be harmony in the international system because, liberal democracies don't go to war with one another. Problem solved. You don't have to worry about the kinds of things that actually resulted in conflict over Ukraine's geopolitical orientation. Um, so there's a combination of not wanting to accept responsibility for what happened and a changing of the guard within the Russia expert community in the West, where you had a bunch of people come to the fore that didn't really understand the kinds of foreign policies that were vital to containment. These were people who were ideological, who believed that foreign policy flows almost exclusively from the nature of the internal system of the country that you're dealing with. Geography and balance of power had little to do with behavior. So they didn't get it, I think is the short answer to all of this. And the old generation kind of, faded away. People get old. Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and George Kennan pass on. And the baton has been handed to a community of experts that have a much different kind of expertise on Russia than in the past. And that's a part of this.
Yeah, no, that's interesting though. More than 3 decades of political class emerging, which has essentially embraced this idea that relations with Russia should be seen in the framework of a teacher and a student, that is to socialize or transform them. I think in this climate, the social constructivist really taken over. And this is what I also noticed, that if you make the point that, well, the Russians always perceived NATO expansion after the Cold War as a major threat because it redivided the continent. It's when one can point to a sea of evidence, yet there's no interest in this. It's always the assumption that, well, if you recognize that this is a threat to Russia, that means you're giving legitimacy to the Russian position, and then it is considered to be pro-Russian, and so then it has to be dismissed. It's very strange. I turn.
Well, and it also it attacks the raison d'etre, so to speak, of Europe post-Cold War. What did Europe become? It did not become a geopolitical actor. It can't be a geopolitical actor because it expanded its membership to the point where it's become paralyzed. Different members of the European Union have much different interests, particularly as they relate to Russia. So it's very hard for them to act as a coherent geopolitical actor. What Europe has become is a regulatory superpower bent on expanding its values, transmitting them, this notion that Europe ought to be about liberalizing countries outside of Europe, and expanding that Western community has become a core purpose of the European Union. And so if Russia comes in and says, yeah, no, what you're doing actually threatens our vital interests, and we're going to go to war to prevent the continuation of what you've been doing, that causes Europe to actually face an existential question. What's our purpose? What are we about? What's our role in the world? And the one that they thought they had settled on after the end of the Cold War is not viable. So what do you do under those circumstances? That's the dilemma that the Europeans are facing right now. It's part of the reason why they don't want to see this war settled, because a compromise end to the war in Ukraine will force them to address that question. And it will force them to acknowledge that the vision that they've had for more than 30 years is bankrupt.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. But it's also difficult for the Europeans, I think, to adjust because, again, if you recognize that the world is multipolar, then one can reach the conclusion that it's not in the interest of the U.S. to devote that many resources to to Europe anymore, because it steals resources from more important regions, and it pushes Russia towards China. But in this country, I saw even an article in the paper arguing that, well, we shouldn't say that the world is multipolar. Again, these are the social constructivists, because if we say it's multipolar, we recognize that Russia's a polar power, then we give legitimacy to Putin. We can't give legitimacy. So essentially we're compelled to walk around, pretend as if there's no multipolarity because this is the right thing to do. So if you say it's not multipolar, then we act accordingly, and then it wouldn't be multipolar. This is my it's a very it's very difficult to to navigate in such an intellectual environment, though. But what do you think are the main misunderstandings then, not just in Europe but also across the West, about how Russia interpreted developments in Ukraine after 2014? That is, after Yanukovych was toppled.
Well, I think Russia's view of events in Ukraine were didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a single event that sparked this. I think um, Russia's views had their roots in at the very beginning, actually, of NATO enlargement, when we were bringing the Czech Republic and Poland and Hungary into the alliance, and we were telling the Russians, no need for concern here. NATO's a defensive alliance, number one, so it doesn't threaten you. Number two, all of these countries, when they come into NATO, they'll feel more secure, more confident, and they'll be able to deal with Russia with much less hostility because they won't feel fearful. They won't feel threatened by Russia. You'll have better relations with them. Um, and I think the Russians looked at this and said, okay, now what happened within a few weeks after Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland joined the alliance? What happened was the Kosovo War, uh, in which NATO actually was a player in this. NATO chose to intervene in Serbia against the Serbs. Why? Not because the Serbs had attacked NATO. They had not. And Serbia was out of area for NATO. It went beyond its borders to take action against another country that had not attacked NATO for things that happened inside of Serbia. You know, a minority Muslim separatist movement had come under attack by the central government, and NATO said this will not stand. But it didn't get UN Security Council authorization for this, and it wasn't attacked. So under international law, this was an illegal act. And the Russians came to us at the time and said, okay, you told us NATO was defensive. You told us we don't have to worry about NATO attacking Russia. What is the guarantee that NATO wouldn't do something like that inside Russia? For example, in retaliation for things that Moscow is doing against Chechnya, a Muslim separatist conflict. And the answer that we provided to the Russians at the time was, well, of course we wouldn't do that in Russia. Russia has nuclear weapons. Now, ironically enough, the Russians said, aha, right. It's not NATO that guarantees our security, the nature of NATO. NATO could, in fact, do this sort of thing. It's our own ability to fight back and deter militarily that protects our security. So having drawn that lesson from Kosovo, the Russians then looked at what NATO did in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, announcing that Ukraine and Georgia would one day be part of the NATO alliance. At a time, by the way, when public opinion in Ukraine was not in favor of joining NATO. The majority of Ukrainians in 2008 did not favor joining the NATO alliance. Now, obviously, things have changed a lot since then, but at the time we said that Ukraine was going to join, the United States was actually pulling pretty hard to get Ukraine and Georgia to come into the alliance. And the Russians looked at that and said, wait a minute, this is getting into the heart of Russia's geopolitically sensitive areas. Russia's been invaded many times from the West, going through where? Ukrainian territory. There's a painful history there. And there's an awful lot of intermixing between Ukrainian and Russian families. There are cultural, religious, linguistic ties, a lot of trade going on there. intermixing of economies. This is extremely sensitive territory, and the Russians reacted to this very strongly. Now, those that say, hey, the Russians are overreacting, they're paranoid. There was no prospect that Ukraine was going to be a part of the NATO alliance anytime soon. The Russians didn't have to invade. This is a pretext. My reaction to that is, well, there is certainly no doubt that Ukraine was not on the brink of formally joining the alliance, but Ukraine was being NATO-ized. The links between NATO militaries and Ukraine in training and equipment and standardization, operating procedures, intelligence cooperation were all deepening. And I think the Russians, with some justification, looked at that process and said to themselves, if those trends continue 5, 10 years from now, Ukraine will be so thoroughly enmeshed with NATO that Russia won't have a military option to prevent formal entry into the NATO alliance, unless Russia is willing to go to war, not just with Ukraine, but with NATO itself. So they saw a window closing there that meant either they had to live with Ukraine ultimately being part of the alliance, or they would have to go to war with NATO itself. And Putin didn't want to have to face that choice. So he acted preemptively and illegally. But this was certainly not the case, that there was no cause for this other than Putin's own imperialist desires. I think it's a far more complex situation than that.
Yeah. Well, I saw an interview you gave actually back in December of 2021. You were one of the people who actually said then that as NATO entrenched itself more and more in Ukraine, the Russians were essentially reaching this conclusion that it's essentially now or never to take military actions. And, that should have been, again, a good 2 months before the Russian invasion, should have been a good warning based on solid evidence. But I have to tell you, though, in Europe, among this, the social constructivists, the people who see the world as, the goal being transforming, they would have looked at this kind of warnings as essentially undermining what NATO is. That is, we don't talk about it being a threat because then we legitimize it being seen as a threat. So all of these cold warnings were essentially, thrown away, I think, a bit.
Right. Well, and I think NATO and Europe more broadly regarded the open door as critical. That was not just a technical issue. It's not just something that was in the Washington Treaty that allowed for the alliance to add new members. It was actually seen as vital to the survival of the NATO alliance itself. And back in the 90s, when this was first being debated, people explicitly used this analogy that if NATO doesn't expand, it will die. It's sort of like a shark. If it's not swimming forward, it can't get air through its gill slits and it will literally die. And I think that belief that NATO had to be enlarging became seen as critical to NATO's purpose and its survival.
Yeah, and of course, if NATO doesn't survive, what keeps the U.S. in Europe? This is the entire world order be built on this. But of course, it is a problematic recipe for stability. The assumption that recipe depends on the world's largest military bloc built against Russia, that it would incrementally go closer and closer to the Russian borders, and hoping that Russia would accept that this would produce stability. But anyways, we're now, since 2022, when the Russians invaded, we've seen this escalation all along. That is, for me, one of the peaks were last year, not just the attacks on the early warning systems of a nuclear attack on Russia, but also the attack on its nuclear retaliatory capabilities, that is, its bombers. But since then, we've seen, at least the rhetoric I hear from Moscow is that the Kremlin is under greater pressure to retaliate as they see NATO going up that escalation ladder. Now, of course, the long-range missiles, the drones, but also the attacks coming from NATO territory. But what happens now, though, if the assumption is that Russia would not dare to attack, but this is happening at a time when the U.S. seems to be drawing down its forces in Europe, and it begs the question whether or not the U.S. would sacrifice New York for Tallinn. But what happens the day after if Russia now retaliates against some German manufacturing plants, logistics centers, or Latvia for that matter? Because I spoke recently with Professor Mearsheimer, who made the point that he seriously doubt the U.S. would fight and die for the Baltic states. But if they don't, that's the end of NATO, isn't it? I mean, what what's keeping you up at night? I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, I think this is an extremely dangerous situation, um, because we're in circumstances where um, the Ukrainians actually would like to see NATO drawn directly into this war against Russia. It's their best bet for being able to prevail in some form on the battlefield. One-on-one, Russia against Ukraine, Ukraine has enormous disadvantages. The more NATO is involved, the more those uh, Russian advantages are mitigated. And the best scenario of all for Ukraine is if NATO forces are directly fighting against Russia. So they would love to provoke some sort of incident where NATO gets drawn into a confrontation militarily with Russia. The Russians know this. At least Putin understands very well the game that's being played here. He knows he's being baited into an overreaction. He understands the consequences of getting involved in a direct confrontation with NATO. He doesn't want to go there. I think he's tried to be very cautious. The problem is the provocations are getting more severe over time. And you mentioned going after one of the legs of the Russian nuclear triad. That's an extremely provocative thing. It strikes at the heart of Russia's nuclear retaliatory capability. Um, Turning the other cheek is a very dangerous thing to do because it gives Europe and Ukraine and the United States the impression that Russia simply will not retaliate. We can do whatever we want, and the Russians will simply grit their teeth and tolerate it. So Putin also understands that, and he's got a lot of people in Moscow who are saying to him, "You can't simply continue to ignore this." And so I think what's happened is the Russians have grown increasingly vocal and increasingly demonstrative to send the message to Ukraine, to Europe, and to the United States that they're not simply going to continue to ignore these deep strikes into Russian territory, that they're going to have to retaliate. So that's why we got the messages about what the Oreshniks are capable of doing. Putin went into a fair amount of public detail saying, here's what they can do. We haven't really used their capabilities yet. We're developing those capabilities, but at some point we may well have to use them. That, I think, is why the Foreign Intelligence Service of Russia issued such a stark warning about Latvian involvement in these drone strikes against Russia and explicitly threatened to attack Latvian facilities that were involved in these attacks. I think what the Russians are trying to do is send a message first and foremost to Washington, which is put a leash on the Ukrainians and the Europeans. Make sure that they don't continue to do this, because if they do, we will have to retaliate. We don't want to have to do that. For right now, I think the message has been received in Washington anyway. We're re-engaging in the peace process. I'm sure you noticed President Trump publicly specifically said, now that we're putting Iran in the rearview mirror, we want to focus more intently on the peace process in Ukraine. So we're re-energizing our involvement there. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are going to be going to Moscow, it was announced. So I think that's all good. It increases the likelihood that the United States can manage this kind of problem. But the last thing that you want to have to do if you're working on the NSC staff is send a memo up the chain saying, well, Mr. President, the Russians have struck NATO territory. And Latvia or fill in the blank has invoked Article 5. So we're going to be faced with a choice. Do we, in fact, uh, go to war with Russia over this and defend our NATO ally and demonstrate that Article 5 remains in effect? Or do we say to the Latvians or whomever, too bad you shouldn't have poked the bear? Good luck, but this is your problem, not ours. Um, that's a very, very painful decision to make. You're choosing essentially between warfare with Russia, which could well turn nuclear, or hollowing out the NATO alliance itself. That's a very bad decision to have to make. So I think it's very much in the interest of the United States to engage diplomatically, bring this war to an end, and avoid ever having to face that kind of decision. Because I don't know how it would turn out, and anybody that tells you they do is probably overconfident. That's a very painful decision.
I agree. It just seems like the pathway to war now is charted very clearly. That is, well, for example, I assume that the drone attacks on Russia through Baltic territory. I assume that well, for example, the Germans may have a hand in this, and now that we heard this stern warning that the Russians might retaliate against the Baltic states, we saw this, statement from the head of the German armed forces that, well, if you strike the Baltic, well, if Russia strikes the Baltic states, then we're gonna hit the Kaliningrad or Moscow or something like this. I mean, if this is the case, if the Germans are bombing Kaliningrad with its, million citizens, this is it's not hard to imagine how few steps that would be away from nuclear retaliation from Russia. I mean, this is its legal documents would approve this in a second, I think. So it's just
Well, yeah, my understanding is that Kaliningrad has more tactical nuclear weapons stored on its territory than probably any other place on Earth on a per square kilometer basis. If you attack Kaliningrad, you automatically cross into the nuclear threshold. You're involved in a nuclear war. So, we are very, very close to that kind of situation right now. But the irony in all of this is that a lot of people in the West have lost their fear of nuclear war, and that's a problem. The fear of nuclear war has a deterrent effect on both sides. It brings sobriety to decisions that isn't there if you really think, well, that's just not possible. That was a threat during the Cold War, but we've been there, we've done that, we've turned the page. We're not going to get into a nuclear war now. We don't have to worry about that. The real fear should not be of nuclear war. The fear should be the fear of nuclear war. We can't allow ourselves to be scared into submission with the Russians. It's a very different psychological climate that we're in right now than we were for almost the entire nuclear period when everybody recognized, boy, we really don't want to go into nuclear war. That would not work out well for anybody. And in the West, that we've largely lost that. And that's a problem because the Russians know it. And you have people like Sergei Karaganov, whom you have talked to extensively, saying we have to restore the fear of nuclear war. That's extremely dangerous. Restoring the fear of nuclear war could easily cross into an escalatory spiral that would be catastrophic. So this is very dangerous territory.